Rebecca is adapted into a movie from the novel of the same name. In the 2020 adaptation of Rebecca, a young woman falls in love with a wealthy widower, Maxim de Winter. As she unravels the mysteries surrounding Rebecca's death, she becomes trapped in a web of secrets and manipulation, leading to a dark revelation that challenges her perception of herself and her husband. How far will this test their love? The movie opens with a monologue where a nameless woman talks about her dream of Manderly, a mysterious and rundown house. In her dream, she finds herself holding a gun. She recalls her troubled summer in Monte Carlo, where she lacked a career and worried about her future. The woman gets out of a cab and enters a hotel, appearing disheveled and carrying many things. Initially, she regrets meeting Ms. Vander Hooper and Maxim de Winter, the wealthy owner of Manderly, and a widower. The unnamed young woman is clumsy and struggles to perform her job well. During lunch, she unintentionally obstructs Maxim, who is standing behind her. Maxim notices her clumsiness and tells the young woman that Mr. de Winter appears cold. Surprisingly, the man in the yellow suit is Maxim de Winter himself. Edith Van Hopper insists that Maxim looks at photos of her nephew, irritating him. She asks the young woman to fetch the photographs, and the young woman complies. Later that night, while the young woman is sketching and lying down, Edith and her friends mock her, laughing at her expense. They discuss the tragedy at Manderly, revealing that the deceased wife's name was Rebecca, and mentions how much the widower, Maxim, was so devastated by it. The next morning, the young woman wakes up a sick Mrs. Van Hopper, who asks her to call a doctor before vomiting. The young woman tries to visit the cafe terrace but is denied entry because she is a staff member. Maxim invites her to join him, and they have a pleasant conversation. Maxim inquires about the young woman's occupation, and she says she works as a lady's companion. Maxim is kind to her, and she feels ashamed of his generosity. When asked about Van Hopper, she confesses that the money is worth it, and Maxim comments on Van Hopper's desperation for companionship due to her loneliness. The young woman mentions that some people enjoy being alone, while others do not. It is revealed that she is an orphan. She orders oysters for breakfast, eager to try them. Both the young woman and Maxim enjoy each other's company. Upon returning to her room, the young woman feels elated. However, she remembers Mrs. Van Hopper is sick but receives a telegram from Maxim. She lies about receiving it and meets Maxim instead, claiming she is going to a tennis lesson. They go for a drive, and the young woman confesses that she likes cars due to her late father's influence. She opens up about her parents' death 2 years ago, and Maxim gets momentarily distracted while driving, narrowly avoiding a collision. They stop near a creek on the island, exploring the garden trail. The young woman impresses Maxim with her knowledge of special plants and flowers. They eventually reach the veranda, admiring the breathtaking view of Monte Carlo. She asks Maxim if he has been to this place before. He responds that he has, but only during his honeymoon. She almost inquires about how his wife died, but Maxim bitterly requests her not to. The woman sulks alone on the other veranda, gazing at the view. Maxim hands her the car keys and urges her to drive while he sits in the passenger seat. She asks about Manderly, and Maxim explains that it is a beautiful property passed down from fathers to sons. Since he has no heir, it will be inherited by her sister and her sister's sons. They enjoy the rest of the day driving around. While exploring, she comes across a book that seems to have belonged to Maxim's late wife. Maxim's face becomes embittered as he observes her opening the book, which holds personal significance to his deceased wife. The young woman senses that Maxim is extremely sensitive when it comes to his late wife. Upon returning, she lies to Van Hopper about attending a tennis lesson, as it is already dark. She receives another note from Maxim, inviting her on another drive. Almost every day, while Van Hopper is indisposed, Maxim continuously invites her on various rendezvous and dates, such as playing tennis or simply sitting by the coast, sending her beautiful notes. They grow closer and their relationship becomes more romantic. They visit the coast and use binoculars to observe two people being intimate on a boat. At the beach, the woman persuades Maxim to join her in swimming against the waves. He carries her and lays her by the shore, where they share kisses and become intimate. As the day comes to an end, they return to Manderly. Edith Van Hopper is doing well, and she announces that they are leaving for New York. Edith Van Hopper discovers that the woman has been spending time with Maxim and discourages her, claiming that Maxim has not yet gotten over his deceased wife. The woman becomes distraught and nearly believes it. She goes to Maxim's room to bid farewell, but Maxim offers her the opportunity to come with him to Manderly and proposes marriage. Edith Van Hopper searches for the woman and stumbles upon Maxim and her kissing, as they announce their plans for the wedding. Mrs. Van Hopper is overjoyed upon hearing the news. However, as soon as Maxim leaves, Mrs. Van Hopper accuses the young woman of plotting to marry a wealthy widowed man. Edith tells her that she is not cut out for the job at Manderly, She further asserts that while the young woman successfully seduces Maxim, the marriage won't be as happy as she thinks. Edith suggests that Maxim is only marrying her because he is lonely and doesn't want to spend time alone in Manderly, haunted by Rebecca's memory. After their marriage and honeymoon around Europe, the newlyweds return home to Manderly as husband and wife. The young woman has now become Mrs. De Winter. Mrs. Danvers, the housekeeper of the house, organizes their arrival with an army of staff eagerly awaiting Mr. De Winter's return. Mrs. Danvers greets them, appearing cold, uptight, and strict. She runs the household and holds a position of authority over the staff. She extends her hand for a handshake, but Mrs. De Winter's glove slips off. Mrs. Danvers kindly picks it up for her. Maxim assures Mrs. De Winter that there is nothing to worry about and that Mrs. Danvers is not as intimidating as she may seem. She then meets more members of the De Winter household. Maxim introduces her to Frank, the estate manager. The men leave her in Mrs. Danvers' care for a tour of Manderly. Manderly is a grand estate, almost like a palace. It has a 300-year history, having been a gift from Henry VIII to the De Winter family. The house is lavish and displays wealth through expensive paintings and antique books. Mrs. De Winter is overwhelmed by the grandeur of the house and the many rooms she needs to remember, as she is not accustomed to such a wealthy background. Mrs. Danvers arranges for a maid named Clarice, although Mrs. De Winter would prefer not to have one. However, she reluctantly accepts at Mrs. Danvers' insistence. It becomes apparent that Rebecca has left a lasting impact on Manderly. There are reminders of her everywhere, including a larger room she once occupied and objects that belonged to the former lady of the house. Mrs. Danvers seems mournful when discussing the Manderly costume balls that Rebecca used to host. Mrs. De Winter urges Maxim to open up to her and share his secrets now that they are married. She specifically asks him to talk about his former wife, Rebecca, but Maxim avoids the topic. In bed, Maxim curls away from Mrs. De Winter as he sleeps. Late at night, Mrs. De Winter begins dreaming about Rebecca but can only see her from the back, where she appears gorgeous. Maxim leaves the bed and seems to sleepwalk, moving like a robot in a single direction. Mrs. De Winter follows him. Then Maxim stops, and when Mrs. De Winter touches him, Mrs. Danvers suddenly appears out of nowhere and reveals that Maxim is sleepwalking. Mrs. Danvers warns that it's dangerous to wake sleepwalkers. Maxim enters a room, and Mrs. Danvers closes the door. Mrs. De Winter returns to their room. In the morning, the staff of Manderly prepares for the day in a military-like uniform style. Mrs. De Winter goes to the breakfast room and overhears Frank and Maxim discussing business matters. She asks Maxim about his sleepwalking, but he avoids the subject once again. Maxim leaves her to enjoy breakfast alone. The maids mock and laugh at her as she walks by. Their dog, Jasper, opens a door, and Mrs. De Winter steps inside. She finds herself in a drawing room that belonged to Rebecca Manderly. There are journals, planners, and other reading materials that belong to Rebecca. She comes across an invitation to a masquerade ball that Rebecca had prepared. While exploring, Mrs. De Winter accidentally breaks one of Rebecca's figurines. She hurts herself while picking up the broken piece and hides it in a compartment. Mrs. De Winter goes to the kitchen to find treatment for her wound. Mrs. Danvers shows her the menu and asks for her opinion. But Mrs. De Winter is not accustomed to such tasks, so she simply approves it without thoroughly verifying it. Unbeknownst to her, Mrs. Danvers intentionally left the sauces blank to gauge her opinion, knowing that the former Mrs. De Winter was particular about them. Mrs. Danvers looks at her with a mocking side eye, implying her incapability. Mrs. De Winter uses a comb that formerly belonged to Rebecca, with Rebecca's hair still on it. She expresses her desire to order new undergarments from London, and Maxim does not object. The following day, they go trekking. Mrs. De Winter misses their sweet honeymoon period. Suddenly, Jasper runs down the hill, and Mrs. De Winter follows, fearing he might fall. This angers Maxim as he tells her to leave Jasper alone. But Mrs. De Winter continues chasing after him. Jasper enters an empty cabin, and Mrs. De Winter follows. The cabin is messy, and Jasper is hissing at an empty wall as if he sees something. Mrs. De Winter tries to tie Jasper with the rope while he barks and hisses at the wall. She suspects there might be someone there, but there is no one present. Jasper goes back inside the room, and as Mrs. De Winter opens the curtain, she discovers a cabin keeper, Ben, hiding behind it, who is familiar with Jasper. Startled, Mrs. De Winter apologizes and ties up Jasper. The cabin keeper informs her that Jasper is not her dog but Rebecca's, and Rebecca doesn't come there anymore because she went to the sea and drowned. The cabin keeper comments that Mrs. De Winter is not like Rebecca. They leave the cabin, and Mrs. De Winter feels upset about being compared to Rebecca. She now understands why Maxim didn't want to go there and confronts him, stating that she wouldn't know anything if he doesn't tell her. Maxim replies that the place is supposed to be locked, but someone is there. Mrs. De Winter chases after Maxim, but she notices seagulls forming in the sky. Beatrice, Maxim's sister, visits, and Mrs. De Winter shows her the wedding pictures and honeymoon photos. The grandmother also pays a visit. Beatrice describes how Max was a wreck before meeting Mrs. De Winter. She encourages her to learn how to hunt and ride, offering to teach her. Beatrice believes Mrs. De Winter should have fun and suggests reviving the ball. Maxim is disappointed with the idea, but Beatrice continues to encourage Mrs. De Winter, stating that she should honor her role as the new bride, wife, and hostess. Giles and Beatrice toast to it. When the grandmother asks Mrs. De Winter if she's just staying at Manderly, Beatrice confirms that she is Maxim's wife. The grandmother laughs in disbelief, claiming that she cannot be Maxim's wife. Giles and Beatrice are stunned and upset by their grandmother's reaction. The grandmother refuses to believe that Mrs. De Winter is the new wife and becomes increasingly agitated, mistaking her for Rebecca. She pulls Mrs. De Winter's arm and has a breakdown. They take the grandmother away as her condition worsens. As they drive away with the grandmother, Mrs. De Winter is visibly shaken, feeling overshadowed by Rebecca. She returns to the hall and witnesses Frith, Maxim, and a young servant boy discussing a missing figurine from the morning room. The boy is crying as Mrs. Danvers fired him, believing he took the figurine, which is very valuable. Overwhelmed with guilt, Mrs. De Winter admits to breaking it. Her confession saves Robert, the servant boy. Mrs. Danvers asks for the broken pieces, which Mrs. De Winter had hidden in the bureau drawer. Maxim instructs Mrs. Danvers to send it to London if it can be salvaged. Mrs. Danvers tells Mrs. De Winter to inform her immediately if anything else happens. Maxim finishes the conversation and leaves, leaving the women alone. Mrs. De Winter is upset and takes out a handkerchief from the coat pocket, realizing that the monogram on it is R, belonging to Rebecca. While Mrs. Danvers watches creepily, Mrs. De Winter removes the coat violently. Mrs. De Winter sleeps in a room without Maxim by her side. She goes to the coastal hill and hides in the cabin, removing the coverings from the furniture. She discovers a photo of a man that belongs to the cabin keeper. Frank enters and assumes that Mrs. De Winter has gone to London with Maxim. M asks Frank to lock the cabin, mentioning that there is no longer a boat and he doesn't want to sail anymore. Mrs. De Winter asks Frank about Rebecca's drowning. He explains that despite being an excellent sailor, Rebecca drowned while on a boat. Her body was found 2 months later. Mrs. De Winter expresses empathy for the tragic accident and imagines how sad Maxim must have been. She asks Frank if Rebecca was beautiful, and he says she was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. Frank goes into the morning room and starts using Rebecca's things, like spraying perfume and feeling the silk. Mrs. Danvers suddenly arrives, remarking that she has kept things the same as if Rebecca had just gone somewhere else. The nightgown Mrs. Danvers laid out for her that night is still there, and Mrs. Danvers insists that Mrs. De Winter smells it. Mrs. Danvers emphasizes their relationship and the dynamics of it. Tension builds as Mrs. Danvers brushes Mrs. De Winter's hair, describing the routine actions that Maxim and Rebecca used to do, such as brushing hair and dressing up for guests. She asks Mrs. De Winter if Maxim brushes her hair like that. Mrs. Danvers insults Mrs. De Winter, claiming she is a second-rate version of Rebecca, and that Mrs. De Winter took Rebecca's husband and name. Mrs. De Winter tells Mrs. Danvers that Rebecca only wanted Maxim to be happy, but Mrs. Danvers sarcastically laughs and says that Maxim will never be happy because Rebecca was the only love of his life. Mrs. De Winter turns away from Mrs. Danvers, unable to believe what she said. She dreams of Rebecca walking in a fabulous dress and heels, and then wakes up to find Maxim sleepwalking again. As she wakes up from her terrible dream, Clarice notices scratches on Mrs. De Winter's skin, indicating that the vines from her dream scratched her. Jack Favel visits the estate and sees the new Mrs. De Winter. She tells him that Maxim is in London. Mr. Favel enters uninvited and runs to the stable, tampering with Rebecca's chair. Once again, they mention how much better Rebecca was at those things. Jack Favel was Rebecca's cousin. Jack Favel teaches Mrs. De Winter how to ride a horse. As they walk, Jack asks if Maxim ever speaks to her about Rebecca, about how she died, and when he last saw her. Jack mentions that there must have been something Rebecca wanted to tell him, but he doesn't know what. Mrs. De Winter suggests that Jack should come back again to ask Maxim, although Jack is banned from Manderly. He advises Mrs. De Winter to keep quiet about his visit, as both of them would not want to face Maxim's anger. Rebecca visits the staff's dining room, and all the staff, including Mrs. Danvers, stand up as a sign of respect. Mrs. De Winter confronts Mrs. Danvers about inviting Jack, knowing that Maxim does not want him on the property. However, Mrs. Danvers denies inviting him and claims not to have seen Jack for over a year. Maxim arrives at the estate, and Frith tells him that it was Mrs. De Winter who invited Jack inside. Mrs. De Winter explains to Maxim that she did invite Jack, but Maxim is angry because he knows she went riding with him. He even believes the lies that Mrs. De Winter invited Jack to the boathouse while wearing new nightwear. Mrs. De Winter is upset that he doesn't believe her. She reassures Maxim that she loves him, trying to convince him that she is not having an affair, and insists that it was Mrs. Danvers who invited Jack. Mrs. De Winter goes up to the attic and knocks on Mrs. Danvers' quarters to confront her. She gives Mrs. Danvers her notice of termination, saying that she is firing her. Mrs. Danvers asks if Maxim agreed to it, but Mrs. De Winter insists that it is her own decision. Mrs. Danvers reveals that she took care of Rebecca since she was very young and came to Manderly together when Rebecca got married. She becomes sad because they were very close and apologizes for projecting her expectations about Rebecca onto Mrs. De Winter. Mrs. De Winter softens a bit and says that they will find a house for Mrs. Danvers, but Mrs. Danvers insists that women can either marry or go into service. She further expresses that Rebecca was her whole life. Mrs. Danvers is somewhat disappointed that Mrs. De Winter is very different from Rebecca. Mrs. De Winter explains that everything is new to her, and it had to do with Mrs. Danvers' expectation of her help. Mrs. Danvers admits that she never asked for her help before, but Mrs. De Winter asks for her help now. Mrs. De Winter then goes and sleeps beside Maxim. He talks and apologizes to her, realizing that it is not her fault that he overreacted. They hug and repair their relationship. In the following days, things become easier for Mrs. De Winter as she gets along better with Mrs. Danvers and improves herself to be a better hostess of the house. Mrs. De Winter prepares for the ball with Mrs. Danvers' help, and they share moments of positivity. However, Mrs. De Winter is still unsure of what to wear for the event. Clarice suggests the lady in the red dress painting, which leaves an impression on Mrs. De Winter, so she decides to wear that. The day of the ball finally arrives, but there is a swarm of crows hovering in the air, which could be seen as a bad omen, along with bad weather. Maxim tries to check the dress, but Mrs. De Winter joyfully forbids him from doing so. Maxim tells her he is proud of her before leaving his wife to prepare. It is raining endlessly when the guests start to arrive, but they are guided inside by the staff. The theme of the costume ball is inspired by the 17th century. Mrs. De Winter is dressed well in her ball gown but feels nervous about hosting her first ball. As she comes down the stairs, excitedly greeted by the guests, she is met with silence. Mrs. De Winter is horrified by the reaction of the guests towards her appearance. Maxim is visibly angry, and Mrs. De Winter defends herself, saying that she saw it in the painting. However, Maxim demands her to change her dress without any explanation. Mrs. De Winter is humiliated and runs upstairs, while Mrs. Danvers smirks. Clarice reveals that it was Mrs. Danvers who gave her the idea to suggest the dress to Mrs. De Winter. Rebecca wore that dress the previous year. Mrs. De Winter cries, and Beatrice helps her find something else to wear and encourages her. Mrs. De Winter changes into a simpler dress. Eventually, the guests seem to forget the earlier faux pas, and the ball proceeds smoothly. Maxim regrets bringing Mrs. De Winter to Manderly. She chases after Maxim into a basement where the staff is having their own party. She is told that she does not belong there, but she enters anyway and becomes immersed in 17th century dancing. Fireworks are set off, and Mrs. De Winter hallucinates that everyone is chanting Rebecca's name, which drives her to a state of madness. The party has ended, and Maxim is still missing. Mrs. Danvers approaches Mrs. De Winter and exacerbates her insecurities, telling her that she will never replace Rebecca and showing her that she is worthless. Mrs. Danvers emphasizes how great Rebecca was, even in death. Mrs. De Winter runs away from Mrs. Danvers' taunting. Mrs. Danvers states that nothing good will happen to Mrs. De Winter, even if she divorces Maxim, because she cannot remarry and is powerless. Mrs. Danvers taunts her, suggesting that she should jump off the roof. As Mrs. De Winter tries to escape the torment, she witnesses a nearby shipwreck. Sailors attempt to rescue a boat and recover a decomposing body, bringing it to shore. It is revealed to be Rebecca's body found in her boat. The police take Maxim away for questioning. Frank speaks to Mrs. De Winter about the situation, as the investigation into Rebecca's death has been reopened. At night, Mrs. De Winter returns to the cabin and finds Maxim there. He tells her that it's over and that Rebecca has won. It turns out that Maxim buried the wrong woman. Maxim swears he didn't know about it. He reveals that Rebecca didn't drown but died before being on that boat. Maxim sabotaged the boat before she went out. Maxim retrieves a revolver and loads it, making Mrs. De Winter seemingly afraid of him now. Maxim confesses that he kept a flat in London to engage in affairs with other men, including his cousin, Jack Favell. He admits that he hated Rebecca because of her cruelty and manipulations. Maxim reveals that he is a coward because he can't divorce her as it would ruin the family name. Mrs. De Winter asks how she died. The day before Rebecca died, she returned from London and appeared different and frail. She told Maxim that she was pregnant, but the child wasn't his, intending to provoke him. Maxim hands the revolver to Mrs. De Winter, reenacting how she died. Rebecca placed the revolver in Maxim's hands and taunted him to shoot her. The bullet went straight through her, and she died. He disposed of her body in the boat. Mrs. De Winter feels a bit relieved because now she knows Maxim does not love Rebecca. She asks why Maxim did not tell her. Maxim explains that he couldn't because he was afraid of losing her or facing legal consequences. He believed that if Mrs. De Winter knew the truth, she would leave him. Mrs. De Winter promises that it will only be the two of them, and she assures Maxim that Rebecca won't win. The next morning, she dresses up like a true madam and attends the inquest of Rebecca's murder. During the court proceedings, it is exposed that Maxim wrongly identified the body of his wife that was buried last year. The police discover that the boat was deliberately damaged to be sunk. They delve into the events of the previous year. Maxim is questioned about his knowledge of the circumstances surrounding his wife's disappearance, and death. Maxim explains that the reason he wrongly identified Rebecca was that she had been at sea for 2 months and was beyond recognition. It is revealed that Rebecca had seen a doctor in London before returning to Manderly. Mr. Fable visits the estate, and both Maxim and Mrs. De Winter are upset to see him there. Jack Fable claims that Maxim killed Rebecca and presents a telegram from Rebecca inviting him to the estate to discuss certain matters. He taunts Maxim, proudly stating that many men had been involved with Rebecca and would happily sleep with the new wife. Maxim slaps Jack, causing him to bleed. Mrs. De Winter asks how much Jack wants for his silence in the note. Maxim calls the police, but Jack claims that they will end up in the same cell. Mrs. Danvers becomes a witness on the stand. Mrs. Danvers is questioned about the circumstances surrounding Rebecca's affair with Jack Fable, based on a note inviting him. Mrs. Danvers reveals that Maxim offered £10,000 in exchange for the note. She inadvertently mentions that Rebecca must be pregnant. The inquest takes a turn, suggesting that the child is Jack Fable's and that Rebecca was keeping it a secret, making discreet trips to a doctor. Fable becomes hysterical and accuses Maxim of murder for killing Rebecca, who had a child with her cousin. The authorities take Maxim away for further investigation. The house is thoroughly searched and turned upside down as they look for all of Rebecca's belongings, including diaries, planners, and any notes, checks, or other documents related to her visits to the doctor. Frank comes to help and eventually finds the desired items. Mrs. Danvers barges in, accusing Frank and Mrs. De Winter of taking Maxim's side. Mrs. Danvers expresses Rebecca's hatred for all the men in her life and voices her desire to have the chance to play around and treat men as toys. Mrs. De Winter fires Mrs. Danvers and she walks away calmly, boldly displaying herself as the mistress of the house, free from Rebecca's shadow. Leaving the mansion, Mrs. Danvers is picked up by Fable. Mrs. De Winter then leaves for London. Nervously driving back to London, Mrs. De Winter visits the doctor that Rebecca had contacted, Dr. John Baker. She sneaks into the doctor's office, but the police arrive, also seeking the same information. Mrs. De Winter sees a document with the name Danvers and steals the file. While evading the police, she reads the file and discovers that Rebecca used a fake name, Rebecca Danvers, and that the doctor she saw was an oncologist and not an obstetrician. Rebecca had uterine cancer, which was too advanced for treatment and would have caused immense suffering until she passed away. Mrs. De Winter deduces that Rebecca chose to end her life by drowning to avoid prolonged pain. Mrs. De Winter is kept at the courts, awaiting Maxim's clearance. Eventually, they prove her innocence and reunite. John Fable appears again, taunting them and claiming that Maxim will soon be caught. Mrs. De Winter stands up to him. Maxim confesses that he hates Rebecca for taking away Mrs. De Winter's youthful glow and joy. They drive home as the dawn breaks, only to discover Manderly engulfed in flames, set on fire by Mrs. Danvers. They try to rescue as many people as possible. Mrs. Danvers is seen at the boat with gasoline on her hands. As the whole estate crumbles, Mrs. De Winter runs towards Mrs. Danvers, begging her to step away from the edge of the cliff. Mrs. Danvers fully reveals her obsession with Rebecca. She is furious because she knows Mrs. De Winter will side with Maxim. Eventually, Mrs. Danvers jumps off the cliff without hesitation. Mrs. De Winter wakes up, sweaty, and realizes it was all just a dream. She is in Egypt with her husband. Then and there, she realizes that she made the right decision by choosing love.